The first thing that unsettled me wasn't the voice on the radio. It was the way the desert went quiet as soon as I heard it. My name is Ethan Cole. I was 36 years old in July of 2018, born and raised in Northern California, and I had spent most of my adult life convincing myself that solitude was freedom. That belief is what put me alone in a faded white Volkswagen Westphalia rolling east through the Mojave long after midnight with nothing but sand, heat, and a crackling CB radio to keep me company. I was headed toward Needles, planning to cut north by sunrise. Barstow was never meant to be more than a fuel stop. But the desert doesn't care about plans. It listens. It waits. And sometimes it answers back. The Mojave at night feels less like land and more like an open wound, flat, exposed, breathing heat long after the sun has gone down. Even with the windows cracked, the air inside the van was stale and metallic, like hot pennies. My hands were slick on the steering wheel. The old Volkswagen hummed and rattled the way it always did, a sound I usually found comforting. That night it felt thin, vulnerable. I turned on the CB radio out of habit, not expectation. Channel 19 was mostly truckers swapping mile markers and warnings about speed traps, familiar noise, human noise. I needed that more than I realized. For a while it was normal, static, laughter, a driver complaining about the heat near Ludlow. I let my shoulders drop a little. The desert slid by in black silhouettes, rock formations like crouched animals, Joshua trees clawing at the stars. Then the static changed. It wasn't louder, it was tighter, focused, like someone slowly turning a dial, searching for something specific. And then a voice cut through. White VW camper westbound. You still awake? My foot eased off the gas without me telling it to. No handle, no call sign, just a description. Too accurate. I glanced at the mirror, half expecting headlights behind me. There were none. The road behind was empty. A ribbon of darkness stretching back forever. I didn't answer. Silence followed, but not the comfortable kind. The static stayed, low and breathing like something holding its place. I told myself it was coincidence. Plenty of Volkswagens passed through this stretch. Plenty of drivers guessed. That's what truckers did. I turned the volume down slightly, trying to reclaim control. A mile passed. Maybe two. Then the voice came back, closer somehow, as if the radio itself had leaned toward me. Ethan, you're headed for Needles, right? My name hit harder than the heat. My grip tightened until my knuckles ached. I hadn't used my name on the radio. I hadn't stopped since Bakersfield. I hadn't spoken to anyone all day. My first instinct was anger, irrational, defensive, the kind that flares when fear hasn't found its shape yet. I told myself it had to be a prank. Someone scanning plates. Someone bored. Still, I answered. Who's this? My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Static swallowed the channel for a moment, stretching long enough that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, just trying to help you out, Ethan. The desert pressed closer. The darkness outside the windshield felt thicker, like it had weight. Help with what? I asked. With where you're about to stop. I hadn't planned to tell anyone where I was stopping. Truth was, I didn't even know yet. I was thinking maybe one of the dirt pull-offs past Barstow, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could sleep a few hours before dawn. How do you know my name? I said. The response came immediately. Too immediate. You told me last time. My stomach dropped. I've never been through here before, I said, sharper than I meant to. Not like this. A pause. Not static this time. Actual silence. The kind that feels intentional. People forget things out here, the voice finally said. Heat messes with memory. That's when the smell changed. At first, I thought it was the engine, old oil, burning dust, but it was sweeter than that. Rotting sweet, like something left too long in the sun. I checked the gauges. Everything looked normal. The van kept rolling, faithful and unaware. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice even, if this is some kind of joke. It's not, the voice cut in, and you should slow down. My headlights washed over a faded sign. Barstow, 5 miles. I wouldn't park where you're thinking, the voice continued. That pull-off near the dry wash, bad place. My heart thudded hard enough that I felt it in my throat. How do you know where I'm thinking of stopping? Another pause, longer this time. Because you stopped there before. The road dipped slightly, and for a split second my headlights caught something off to the side, movement near the shoulder. I flinched, steering just a hair to the left. When I looked again, there was nothing, just scrub and shadow. I told myself it was an animal. Coyotes were common out here, so were mirages, so was fear when you let the dark get inside your head. "Listen," I said, forcing a laugh that didn't sound like mine. "You've got the wrong guy." Static rolled across the channel, heavy and uneven, like breath through a damaged lung. "No," the voice said quietly. "I don't." The CB hissed, then clicked. For a moment, I thought that the connection had dropped. Relief flooded me so fast it made me dizzy. Then the radio crackled again. Different now. Not the same voice. There were others. Whispers overlapping. Fragments of words. A woman laughing softly. A man coughing. Someone humming a tune I almost recognized but couldn't place. I reached for the volume knob, but before I could turn it down, one voice rose above the rest. Low. Familiar. "You didn't lock the passenger door, Ethan." Cold spread through my chest. Slow and deliberate. I glanced to my right. The lock was down. The smell inside the van grew stronger, thick enough to taste. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming to run, but there was nowhere to run to. Just road. Just desert. Just the radio, alive with voices that knew me far too well. "Who are you?" I whispered. Static surged, then cleared. "We're the reason you don't remember stopping," the voice said, "and we're right where you're about to pull over again." The Barstow exit loomed ahead, glowing pale in the distance. My hands shook as I tightened my grip on the wheel, the engine's hum suddenly sounding fragile, like it might give up at any second. And somewhere beneath the radio chatter, beneath the desert wind pressing against the van, I heard something else, a knock. Not on the radio, on the side of my Volkswagen. The knock came again, slow, deliberate, knuckles against thin metal, and the sound traveled through the Volkswagen's frame like a pulse through bone. I didn't scream. I didn't slam the brakes. I didn't even look right away. My body chose stillness, the way prey sometimes does when it realizes running might make things worse. The van was still moving, just under 50, tires humming against asphalt, headlights fixed forward as if I could outrun whatever had reached out of the dark. The CB radio was silent now, no static, no voices, just dead air. My breathing sounded too loud inside my skull. Each inhale scraped hot and dry like I was breathing through gauze. I told myself it had to be a branch, a bird, debris kicked up from the shoulder, anything that fit inside the rules of the world I understood. Then the passenger side window fogged. Not all at once, just a small oval bloom expanding outward as if someone had leaned close and exhaled slowly. The desert heat made that impossible. There was no temperature difference, no reason for condensation. A fingertip dragged down the glass, clearing a thin line. I turned my head. There was no face, just a shape where a face should have been, darker than the night behind it, pressed close enough that I could see the outline of a forehead, a nose, a mouth that never moved. It kept pace with the van without effort, as if the road meant nothing to it. I swerved. The shape didn't fall back. It didn't stumble. It stayed right there, gliding, matching my speed like a reflection that had slipped free of the mirror. The radio crackled to life. "Eyes on the road, Ethan." The voice was back, the original one, calm, familiar, almost gentle. "What do you want?" I shouted, the question ripped out of me raw, stripped of any attempt at control. "To remind you," the voice said. "You promised you wouldn't forget us again." The shape outside the window lifted something, a hand, I think, and tapped once more against the glass. Tap. The sound was softer now, intimate. I slammed the accelerator. The old engine protested, rattling like loose teeth, but the speed climbed. 60, 65. The shape blurred, then thinned, then was gone, peeled away by the darkness as if it had never been there at all. I didn't slow down. The Barstow exit flew past on my right, green signs swallowed by the rearview mirror. I didn't care where I ended up anymore. I just needed distance. The smell lingered, sweet rot and hot dust, clinging to the upholstery, my clothes, my thoughts. My hands shook so badly I had to lock my elbows to keep the wheel straight. "Good," the voice murmured through the CB. You remembered that part. What part? I said, my throat burning. Not to stop when we knock. A memory stirred. Not clear, not whole, but heavy. The sense of standing outside the van, heat pressing down, radio hissing behind me, the feeling of being watched before I ever saw anything watching back. I've never been here, I insisted, though the words felt thin even as I said them. You have, the voice replied. July. Same heat, same road, same van. Images flickered at the edge of my mind like heat lightning, a dirt pull-off. Headlights cutting across scrub, the radio on, louder than it needed to be. Why can't I remember? I asked. Static crept back into the channel, low and restless. Because remembering hurts more than forgetting, the voice said, and because you asked us to take it away. The road narrowed, lanes bleeding into shadow, no other vehicles, no lights ahead. My fuel gauge hovered just above empty, a detail that felt suddenly enormous. What did I do? I whispered. The CB popped, another voice broke in, female this time, strained and distant. He left us. The words landed like a weight on my chest. He said he'd come back, another voice added. Male, younger, angry. He said he wouldn't forget, the woman said again, closer now. The radio filled with overlapping sound, snatches of argument, grief, accusation, each voice tugging at something buried deep in me. I pressed my palms against my ears, but the sound came from inside as much as out. Stop, I begged. Please. The voices faded, leaving only the original one. You parked near the wash, it said. You were tired. You said just a few hours. You said you'd keep the radio on. My chest tightened. The image sharpened. I could see it now. The way the dirt crunched under my boots, the way the night felt crowded despite the open space. You heard us then too, the voice continued. You thought we were truckers, lost travelers. You answered back. The van drifted slightly. I corrected, heart hammering. What happened? I asked. Silence stretched taut as wire. You opened the door, the voice finally said. A flash, hands on the handle, a knock from outside, the belief that another human was standing there, needing help. I tasted bile. You stayed, the voice went on. You listened, and when the sun came up, you drove away. No, I said, shaking my head. I wouldn't do that. You did, it replied, because you were afraid and because leaving was easier than carrying us with you. The guilt hit harder than the fear. I didn't know. I said, I don't remember. That was the deal, the voice said softly. We let you forget, but forgetting doesn't break a promise. The fuel light flickered on. Panic surged, sharp and immediate. I scanned the road ahead. Nothing. No exits. No lights. Just darkness pressing in from all sides. What happens now? I asked. The radio crackled, and for the first time the voice sounded uncertain. Now, it said, you decide whether you stop again. The engine sputtered. Once. Twice. The van lurched, speed bleeding away despite my foot on the gas. I coasted to the shoulder, gravel crunching under tires, the desert opening up around me like a mouth. The engine died. Silence crashed down, thick and absolute. The CB radio stayed on. You're almost where it happened last time, the voice said. You can hear them if you listen. And beneath the hum of cooling metal, beneath my own ragged breathing, I did hear something. Footsteps. Slow. Approaching. Circling the van. Knuckles brushed the metal skin, tracing, remembering. A shape passed through the edge of my headlights, then another. Don't open the door, the voice warned. That's how it starts. My hand hovered inches from the handle. Every instinct split down the middle. Run or face it, flee or atone. Ethan, the voice said, using my name the way someone does when they need you to understand something important. You don't get to forget twice. The knocking began again, spreading around the van in no particular order. A dozen hands where there should have been none. And this time, mixed with the knocks, were voices calling softly through the metal, asking for help, using my name. The knocking wasn't loud. That was the worst part of it. It wasn't fists slamming or metal denting under force. It was patient, curious. Fingertips and knuckles brushing the van's skin as if learning its shape by touch alone. Each tap landed with intent, spaced just far enough apart that my mind filled in the gaps with faces, with bodies standing inches away where the darkness refused to show them. Ethan, someone whispered from the driver's side. The voice sounded young, male, breathing hard like he'd been walking a long time. Please, another voice followed, closer to the back doors. A woman this time. Hoarse, exhausted. We know you're in there. My stomach twisted. The smell had thickened, heavy and damp now, like old cloth pulled from a flooded basement. It clung to the air, coating my tongue, making every breath feel like a compromise. I kept my hands on my knees. If I reached for the door, I wasn't sure I'd stop. The CB radio crackled softly, the only thing inside the van that still felt anchored to reality. Listen to the spaces between the knocks, the voice on the radio said. They're waiting for you to fill them. I don't understand, I whispered. You do, it replied. You just don't want to. A memory broke loose, not a full scene, but a sensation. Standing outside the van, barefoot on cold dirt, the heat finally gone but replaced by something heavier. The radio's glow spilling onto the ground, voices rising from the static, lonely and hopeful. You answered because you didn't want to be alone, the voice continued. You stayed because you thought listening was enough. The knocking shifted, closer together now. Faster. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan, the young man's voice said again, clearer now. You said you'd take us with you. My throat closed. I can't, I said louder, as if volume could make it true. I don't even know who you are. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything went still. No knocks, no movement, no wind. The desert held its breath. Then the woman spoke again, right outside the driver's door. That's what you said last time. Something scraped along the side of the van, slow and deliberate, like a nail dragged across paint. I flinched, a sharp sound tearing out of my chest. You promised us the road, another voice chimed in. Older, bitter. You promised us lights, towns, morning. The radio hissed louder, as if straining to be heard over them. They're not lying, the voice on Channel 19 said. They just aren't telling you everything. What aren't they telling me? I asked. That they don't remember choosing either, it said. That they only remember the moment you left. The knocking resumed, but now it had rhythm, patterns repeating, echoing the cadence of speech. My head throbbed as my mind tried to map it to make sense of it. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, 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 pause, tap. The same pattern I'd used earlier, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel to stay awake. My skin prickled. You hear that? The radio voice asked. They learned it from you. The interior of the van felt smaller, the ceiling pressing down, the walls inching inward. Sweat pooled at the base of my spine, cold despite the heat. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, I said. If I did something wrong, you did, the voice said gently, but not because you're cruel, because you're human. The footsteps began to circle again, faster now, overlapping, bodies brushing past each other in the dark. Shadows flickered at the edge of the headlights, never quite solid enough to focus on. Open the door, the young man pleaded. We're so tired. The woman sobbed softly. I just want to sit down, she said, just for a minute. My hand moved on its own, lifting Nesh trembling inches from the handle. The radio crackled sharply. If you open it, the voice warned, you don't get to leave alone. What happens if I don't? I asked. The knocking stopped all at once. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. If you don't, the voice said, you'll remember everything. The weight of that settled deep in my chest. Remembering meant facing what I'd done. Remembering meant carrying it forward, mile after mile, with no promise it would ever get lighter. The footsteps retreated a few paces, as if giving me space to decide. I can't take you with me, I said, my voice breaking, but I won't forget you again. The radio went quiet. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the woman spoke one last time, her voice no longer pleading, just tired. That's what you said before. A sharp bang hit the back doors, hard enough to rattle the entire van. Another followed on the passenger side. The knocking returned, frantic now, no rhythms, no patience. I screamed. I slammed my foot against the brake, against the gas, against anything, but the engine stayed dead, unresponsive, as if it had decided this was where the road ended. Ethan, the radio voice said urgently, breaking through the chaos, you need to turn the radio off. What? I shouted. They can't hear you if you're not listening, it said, but once you turn it off, you don't get guidance anymore. The knocking grew louder, hands slapping metal, voices rising in pitch and volume, overlapping into something almost animal. Hurry, the voice urged. They're remembering too. My fingers closed around the power knob. Every instinct screamed that this was a mistake, that silence would be worse, that I needed the voice, needed something familiar to anchor me. A hand slammed against the driver's window, leaving a smeared print that slid downward slowly like it was melting. I twisted the knob. The radio clicked off. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was crowded. The knocking stopped. The footsteps froze. Then from everywhere at once came a sound I hadn't heard yet. Breathing. Right outside every wall of the van, in sync with mine. And in that shared, suffocating quiet, memory finally clawed its way fully back. The memory didn't arrive like a scene replayed on a screen. It came a sensation first, heat radiating up through the soles of my feet, the sting of gravel, the weight of exhaustion pressing my spine into a shallow curve. I was outside the van. I knew that before I saw it. The white Volkswagen sat behind me with its headlights on, washing the desert in a pale, artificial dawn that felt wrong for the hour. The radio was on, loud. Channel 19 hissed and breathed, the sound filling the space because I was afraid of how empty everything felt without it. I remembered talking. I remembered answering voices that sounded grateful, relieved, human. I remembered believing that was enough. They were stranded. Or at least that's what they said. Said their truck overheated. Said they'd been walking for hours. I never saw the vehicle. Never questioned why they stayed just outside the edge of the light. The desert teaches you not to look too closely at silhouettes. Shapes lie out here. Distance lies. I remembered how tired I was, how badly I wanted to sit down, how good it felt to be needed. The first one stepped into the light slowly. A young man, early 20s maybe. His clothes were dusty, his face drawn tight by thirst and sun. He smiled when he saw me, and something in my chest loosened. Then another voice spoke from the dark, then another. They didn't step forward all at once. They didn't rush me. They just talked, stories, names, destinations. Each word another thread tying me there, keeping my feet rooted to the dirt. At some point, the radio changed. The static sharpened. The voices on Channel 19 grew quieter, almost reverent, like they were listening to something else too. I remembered feeling watched, not by the people in front of me, but by the desert itself. Like the land had leaned closer, curious. Someone asked if they could sit in the van. I hesitated. That hesitation mattered more than anything that came after, because that's when the smell first appeared, sweet and wrong. And I realized too late that none of them cast shadows. Panic didn't come all at once. It crept. Rationalization held the door open long enough for fear to slip inside and lock it behind me. I told myself it was exhaustion, heat, dehydration. I told myself I was projecting stories onto strangers because I was alone. They didn't touch me. They didn't have to. The radio spoke then, not like before, not voices pretending to be human. Something underneath, something that had learned how to use our language but hadn't learned when to stop. I remembered the words clearly now. You don't have room for all of them. I remembered backing toward the van, heart racing, hands shaking, every instinct screaming to leave. I remembered the young man reaching out, not to grab me, just to keep me there. I remembered saying I'd be right back. I remembered getting into the van. I remembered locking the doors. I remembered driving away while they stood in the headlights, not chasing, not yelling, just watching, as if they already knew how it would end. The memory snapped into the present like a broken bone set too fast. I was back inside the van, engine dead, night pressed against the windows, breath fogging the glass in slow, synchronized pulses that were no longer mine alone. Outside, they waited. I understood now what the voice on the radio had been. Not a guide, not a savior, a reminder, a witness. Something bound to the road the way they were bound to that place, caught between travelers, feeding on the moments we choose ourselves over others. The breathing outside deepened. I spoke into the dark, not to the radio, not to them, but to the truth I'd been running from for years. I left because I was afraid, I said, but I won't pretend I didn't know. The fog on the windows thinned as if the van itself were listening. I can't take you with me, I continued, but I can stay. The words tasted like rust and relief. The breathing paused. A shape moved into the headlights, then another. They were clearer now, not whole, not solid, but closer to human than before. The young man stood nearest, his face softer than I remembered, sadness replacing the expectation. "That's different," he said. "I know," I replied. My hand found the door handle. This time it didn't shake. The radio clicked on by itself. One last burst of static. One last breath. "That's all the road ever asks," the voice said quietly, "that you don't look away." I opened the door. The heat rushed in, thick and alive. The smell surged, then faded, replaced by dry air and dust and something almost clean. The ground felt solid under my feet as I stepped down, the van's interior lights spilling out behind me like a lifeline I was choosing to loosen, not cut. They didn't touch me. They just stood there as the desert slowly began to brighten, not with sunrise, but with something softer like memory finally settling. When the engine turned over again, on its own, I didn't get back inside. I watched the Volkswagen roll forward, empty, headlights cutting a clean path down the highway before disappearing into the dark. The desert exhaled. By morning, there was nothing left but tire tracks, already filling with sand. Years later, when I hear static on the radio, especially on Channel 19, I don't turn it off anymore. I listen. Not because I expect voices to call my name, but because the road remembers. And it doesn't let us forget who we were when it mattered most. The snow didn't fall like snow usually does. It arrived silently like something holding its breath. My name is Caleb Mercer, and in December of 2021, I was 39 years old, alone in my Volkswagen rig, parked deeper in Wyoming's Wind River Range than I should have been for that time of year. I'd told myself it was a test of discipline, of solitude, of whether I still knew how to sit with silence without needing to escape it. That's what I said out loud anyway. The truth was quieter and uglier. I didn't want to be around people, and the mountains don't ask questions. I'd been RV camping for over a decade by then, desert boondocking in Utah, long pine stretches in Oregon, windy, lonely pullouts in Montana where the sky feels close enough to touch. I knew cold. I knew snow. I knew the way isolation can play tricks on you if you let it. That confidence, the belief that I'd seen enough to recognize danger, was the first mistake I made out there. The Wind River Range in winter doesn't welcome you. It tolerates you. The access road I took hadn't been plowed in days, maybe longer. I followed older tire ruts until they disappeared under fresh powder, then eased the rig into a small clearing framed by lodgepole pines and rock outcroppings glazed in ice. No other vehicles. No smoke. No footprints. Just the low hiss of wind threading through branches and the soft ticking of my engine cooling down. I remember thinking how clean everything looked. Too clean. Snow smooths the world until it feels unreal, like a stage set waiting for someone to step into the light. I shut the engine off and sat there for a full minute, hands on the steering wheel, listening. That's something you learn after enough nights out alone. Silence isn't empty. It has layers. Wind. Wood contracting. Distant movement you can't place. That night, though, there was nothing distinct enough to grab onto. Just stillness pressing against the windows. Inside the rig, the air smelled faintly of diesel, cold fabric, and the coffee I'd spilled earlier that day. I turned on the heater, felt the vibration under my boots, and started my routine. Curtains drawn, stove checked, headlamp hung by the door. I moved slowly, deliberately, like speed itself might provoke something. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the storm had fully arrived. Snow tapped softly against the roof, a dry, whispering sound like fingers brushing paper. It was soothing in the way that makes you drop your guard. I slept deeper than I expected. When I woke, it was because of the cold, not the normal kind, the gradual seep through layers, but the sharp awareness that something had changed. The heater was still running. The rig was intact, but the air felt exposed, as if the insulation between me and the outside world had thinned overnight. Gray light filtered through the curtains, morning but heavy with cloud. I unzipped the bag, pulled on my boots, and reached for the curtain by the rear window. I wish I'd taken another second, one breath, one moment longer before looking. The snow around the rig was no longer smooth. Bare footprints circled it. They weren't rushed. They weren't random. Each print was placed with intention, pressed deep into the fresh snow, forming a slow, deliberate ring around my vehicle. Toes visible, heels sunk, no shoes, no boots, just bare human feet, wrapped once around the rig like a boundary. I counted without meaning to. 22 steps, maybe 23. My first reaction wasn't fear, it was irritation. That strange, misplaced annoyance you feel when reality doesn't follow the rules you expect it to. Someone's messing with you, I thought. Some idiot hiker trying to get a rise out of campers. Then I noticed something that tightened my chest. There were no tracks leading away. I scanned outward, my breath fogging the glass, eyes following the line of prints, searching for where they broke off. Snow blanketed everything beyond the circle, untouched, pristine. No drag marks, no overlap. Just the ring, and then nothing. The smell hit me next. Not strong, not obvious, just a faint, sour edge in the air, and like damp skin left too long and cold. I told myself it was the heater. Old systems do that. They push strange smells when the temperature drops too fast. I stepped outside anyway. Cold bit instantly, sharp and punishing. The snow was deeper than it looked, swallowing my boots up to the ankle. I crouched near the closest print. The detail was wrong, toes splayed wider than normal. The arch pressed too flat. Whoever had walked there had done so slowly, evenly, without slipping, bare feet in sub-zero conditions, leaving clear impressions but no sign of damage or hesitation. I reached out, then stopped myself. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to confirm how real it was. The forest was quiet in a way that felt staged. No birds, no wind now. Even the snow had stopped falling, leaving everything suspended, waiting. I stood there longer than I should have, my pulse loud in my ears, until the cold forced me back inside. I locked the door. That sound, metal clicking into place, felt louder than it should have. Inside, the rig felt smaller, closer, like the walls had shifted inward while I was outside. I sat at the small table, wrapped my hands around a mug I hadn't poured anything into yet, and tried to think through explanations. Sleepwalking. Unlikely, I'd been alone. Prank. Impossible unless someone had flown in. Hypothermia hallucinations. Maybe. But the prints were there. I'd stood in them. That's when the knocking started. Not loud, not aggressive. Just 3 soft taps on the side of the rig, near the rear panel. Slow. Patient. As if whoever or whatever was outside knew I was awake now and didn't need to rush. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I stared at the wall, at the thin insulation separating me from the cold, from the prints, from the thing that had walked a perfect circle and then disappeared. 3 more knocks, same rhythm, same spot. The sound wasn't threatening on its own. It was almost polite, and that was what scared me most, because it didn't sound like something trying to get in. It sounded like something making sure I stayed exactly where I was. I remember thinking about all the times I'd ignored my instincts in the past, all the moments I'd rationalized discomfort because turning back felt like weakness. Out there, in that rig, surrounded by snow that recorded everything and explained nothing, I realized how dangerous that habit had become. The knocking stopped. Silence rushed back in, heavier than before. I stayed frozen, waiting for the next sound, the next sign, my mind racing ahead to possibilities I didn't want to name. Outside, the tracks waited. Inside, the air felt thinner with every breath. And somewhere between the two, something had decided I was worth noticing. I don't know how long I stayed sitting there after the knocking stopped, but time lost its usual shape. Minutes stretched thin, elastic, pulling at my nerves until every sound inside the rig felt amplified. The heater's low rumble, the faint creak of cooling metal, the soft brush of my own breath against my scarf. I waited for panic to arrive in a rush, but instead it seeped in slowly, like cold through a cracked seal. Eventually, I forced myself to move. Stillness, I'd learned, can become its own trap. I stood and crossed to the front window, parting the curtain just enough to look out. The circle of tracks was still there, untouched. No new prints, no disturbance. The snow beyond them remained smooth, unbroken. Whatever had been outside hadn't left the way it arrived. If it had arrived at all in any way, I understood. I told myself I needed information. That's how I framed it. Not courage, information. I grabbed my parka, gloves, and the heavy flashlight I kept by the door. My hand hovered over the lock for a long second before I turned it. The click echoed inside my chest. Cold slammed into me as soon as the door opened, stealing my breath. The smell was stronger now. That same faint, sour note mixed with something metallic like old pennies pressed into snow. I stepped down carefully, boots crunching louder than they should have in the quiet. I followed the tracks slowly, walking their circle, studying each impression. They never crossed, never overlapped. Whoever made them hadn't paused or shifted weight. It was a continuous, unbroken path, like a ritual completed exactly once. When I reached the point where the circle closed, I crouched low, sweeping my light outward, searching again for any sign of exit. Nothing. My pulse thudded harder. A rational explanation began to feel less like logic and more like denial, wearing logic's clothes. I straightened and scanned the tree line. The pines stood still, branches heavy with snow, their shadows deep and uneven. For a moment, I thought I saw movement between two trunks, a darker vertical shape where no shadow should be. But when I fixed the light there, it was gone. I backed toward the rig, every instinct screaming at me to get inside, to seal myself off from whatever rules the outside was playing by. As I reached for the door handle, something crunched behind me. Not footsteps, not quite. More like snow compressing under a slow, deliberate weight. I turned too fast, heart hammering, light sweeping wild arcs across the clearing. Nothing stood there. The tracks hadn't changed. The trees hadn't moved. The sound came again, closer this time, off to my left, just beyond the circle. That's when I noticed the temperature shift. The cold wasn't uniform anymore. It came in pockets, uneven, like stepping through invisible drafts. My breath fogged thicker near the tree line, thinner closer to the rig. I backed up another step and felt the air warm slightly, just enough to register. The circle wasn't just marks in snow. It was a boundary. I didn't test that idea further. I climbed back into the rig and locked the door with shaking hands, piecing together fragments of old stories I'd heard in campgrounds, half-whispered warnings passed off as jokes, about things that mark space, about winter trails that don't belong to animals or people. I'd never believed them, not fully. Belief implies commitment. I'd always kept my distance. Now distance felt irrelevant. The knocking started again as soon as I sat down. This time it wasn't 3 taps, it was 1. Then another. Slow, irregular, moving. The sound traveled along the side of the rig, metal responding differently depending on where it was struck. I tracked it in my head as it passed beneath the window, toward the front panel, then stopped. A long pause followed. Too long. Then came the voice. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, just a low, breathy sound that hovered at the edge of language, like someone trying to remember how words work. The cadence was wrong, too measured, too careful, as if each syllable had to be chosen and placed. Caleb. My name slid through the thin walls like smoke. I stood so fast my chair tipped over, my chest tightened, air refusing to move the way it should. No one knew I was here. I hadn't checked in. I hadn't told anyone my route. I'd chosen this spot precisely because it was empty. The voice came again, closer to the door now. Cold, out, here. I pressed my back against the opposite wall, every muscle locked. My mind searched desperately for explanations that didn't involve acknowledging what my body already knew. Maybe I'd said my name out loud earlier. Maybe someone had followed me in without my noticing. Maybe another knock, firmer this time. Not violent, insistent, open. The word landed heavy, carrying a weight that pressed against my sternum. It wasn't a request, it wasn't a demand, it was an assumption, as if the outcome had already been decided and the sound was just a formality. I shook my head, though no one could see me. "No," I whispered, the word tearing itself free. Silence followed. Absolute, crushing silence. Even the heater seemed to dim, its vibration dropping to a barely there hum. The air inside the rig grew colder, breath frosting the inside of the windows now. Then the scratching began. Not frantic, not animal. Just a slow drag along the metal siding, nails, or something like nails, testing the surface, learning it. The sound made my teeth ache. It moved in short passes, stopping, starting again, mapping the shape of the rig with unsettling patience. I slid down to the floor, pulling my knees tight, my flashlight clutched uselessly in my hand. I thought about my past trips, about the times I dismissed fear as inexperience, had pushed through discomfort because quitting felt like failure. That mindset had carried me far, but it had also taught me to ignore the quiet voice that says this isn't right. Outside, the scratching reached the door. I could picture it then, not clearly, not fully, but enough to know I didn't want to see it. Something standing just beyond the thin barrier, barefoot in the snow, breath steady, waiting for me to make the mistake it expected. The handle rattled once, gently. "Caleb," the voice said again, closer than it should have been. "You invited me." I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't traveling through air alone. It felt internal, like a memory I couldn't place. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. No scratching, no voice, no movement. I stayed curled on the floor, counting my breaths, waiting for the next escalation. When none came, I dared to look up. Frost had crept across the windows in branching patterns, obscuring the outside world completely. The rig felt sealed in ice, cocooned. Hours passed, or minutes. I don't know. Eventually, the heater sputtered, then cut out entirely. The cold rushed in, sharp and unforgiving. I scrambled up, checking the system, my fingers clumsy with numbness. Nothing. Dead. The rig had become a metal box in a freezer, and staying inside was no longer an option. I pulled on every layer I had, my movements frantic now, panic finally breaking free of its slow boil. I grabbed my keys, my pack, my phone. Still no signal, and stood by the door, hand on the lock. Outside, something shifted its weight. Not inside the circle, just beyond it. Waiting. I closed my eyes, heart pounding, knowing that whatever lesson this place was determined to teach me was about to demand its price, and I had no idea which choice would cost less. I stood there with my hand on the lock, every instinct screaming in different directions, my mind fractured between survival math and a deeper, older fear that didn't care about logic at all. The cold inside the rig was no longer tolerable. My fingers burned, then dulled, that dangerous transition every winter camper learns to respect. Staying meant freezing. Leaving meant stepping into a space that had already proven it didn't follow rules I understood. Outside, the snow made a soft, compressing sound again. Closer this time, but still not crossing the circle. I remembered something then. A detail so small I'd ignored it when I arrived. The clearing wasn't random. It had been too perfect, too round, like the land itself had been worn into that shape over time. I'd parked inside something old without realizing it, assuming emptiness meant safety. I unlocked the door. Cold slammed into me like punishment. My headlamp cut a narrow tunnel through the frost-heavy air, illuminating the circle of tracks once more. They looked deeper now, more pronounced, as if the snow had settled around them instead of filling them in. I stepped down carefully, boots landing just inside the boundary, my breath ragged in my chest. Nothing happened. No sound, no voice. I took another step, still inside the circle. The air felt wrong here, not colder, not warmer, but charged like the moment before a storm breaks. My skin prickled beneath my layers. I moved slowly toward the driver's door, keys clenched so tightly in my fist they bit into my palm. That's when I saw the change. One of the footprints, just one, had shifted. The snow inside it was darker now, wet where it hadn't been before, fresh, as if the foot that made it had returned briefly, pressed down again, testing the ground. I froze. The voice didn't come from outside this time. It came from everywhere at once, low and close, wrapped around the clearing like fog. Too late. The temperature dropped so fast my breath came out in sharp white bursts. Frost raced across the metal skin of the rig, spreading in spiderweb patterns. My headlamp flickered, dimmed, then steadied again, as if struggling against an unseen pressure. I ran. Not blindly, not yet, but fast enough that my boots slipped in the snow. I lunged for the driver's door, yanked it open, and hauled myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. The engine coughed when I turned the key, once, twice, then caught with a shudder that felt like mercy. Outside, the scratching returned, not at the door, not at the sides, but beneath me. The entire rig rocked, just slightly, as if something had leaned against it, testing its weight. My heart pounded so hard it blurred my vision. I threw it into gear and hit the gas, tires spinning uselessly for a split second before gripping just enough to pull free of the clearing. As the rig lurched forward, the headlamp swept across the circle one last time. The footprints were filling in, not with falling snow, but collapsing inward as if the ground itself were reclaiming them. In their place, standing just beyond where the boundary had been, was a shape I couldn't fully see. Tall, still, wrong in its proportions, like a person assembled from memory instead of anatomy. It raised one arm slowly, not in threat, in farewell. I didn't look again. I kept driving, heart in my throat, following the barely there road by instinct more than sight. The forest closed in on both sides, trees blurring past like dark sentinels. Every sound from the rig made me flinch. Every shadow felt like pursuit, but nothing followed. The farther I drove, the more the air seemed to loosen its grip. The cold eased from lethal to merely bitter. My breathing slowed. The sense of being watched thinned, stretched, and finally snapped, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. I didn't stop until I reached a plowed turnout miles down the mountain, dawn just beginning to bleed pale color into the sky. I parked there, engine still running, hands shaking on the wheel, and stared straight ahead until the sun fully cleared the horizon. In daylight, everything feels smaller, manageable, qabil tafsir. That's the lie morning tells you. I checked the rig once I felt steady enough to step outside. No scratches underneath, no damage, just snow and road grime and the quiet hum of an engine that had done its job. If not for the memory, I could have convinced myself nothing had happened at all. But when I looked at my boots, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Bare footprints. Not circling the rig this time. Standing beside the driver's door, one set, toes pointed toward the road. I left them there. I didn't photograph them. I didn't measure them. Some things don't need proof to be real. They need respect. I drove straight to the nearest town and checked into a place with lights, heat, and people. I didn't sleep that day, or the next night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the knocking again. Soft, patient, certain. In the months that followed, I thought a lot about what that night took from me. But it also gave me something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Humility. The understanding that solitude isn't the same as safety, that wild places aren't empty just because we don't recognize what lives there. I still RV camp, still chase quiet roads and long horizons, but I don't push through that inner resistance anymore. When the land feels wrong, when silence presses instead of opens, I listen, I leave. I don't need to prove anything to places older than my fear. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, and some tracks aren't meant to be followed. Out there in winter, the land is always watching. Not with malice, not with kindness, but with memory. And if you step where you don't belong, it may not chase you. It may just wait, and that I've learned is far worse. The first thing that felt wrong was how warm the food still was. I didn't notice it right away, not in the way that makes the hair on your arms lift. At first, it was just a detail my mind filed away, the way you notice a clock ticking louder than it should or a room feeling slightly off balance. The smell of cooked meat hung low in the air, thick and savory, mixed with wood smoke and pine sap. It was the smell of dinner, recent and human, the kind of smell that meant people were nearby. But there were no people. My name is Elliot Harper. I was 38 years old in May of 2020, newly divorced, exhausted in the way only silence can make you, and driving a beat-up Volkswagen camper I'd owned since my 20s. I grew up in Pennsylvania, but that spring I headed north into upstate New York, chasing quiet. Everyone was. The world felt sick and loud at the same time, and I needed somewhere that didn't ask questions. The campground sat just off a secondary road near the Adirondack foothills. No gate, no ranger booth, just a wooden sign with peeling paint and a map bleached white by years of weather. I remember thinking that the place felt abandoned, but not neglected. That's an important difference. The gravel road was freshly graded. The grass around the sites was cut low. Someone had been maintaining it. The sky was already darkening when I rolled in, the clouds stacked low and heavy like they were holding their breath. I parked the VW in a pull-through site near the center loop. That's when I saw the chairs. 3 camp chairs arranged around a fire pit. The fire was still burning. Low, steady, orange coals breathing gently. A pot sat over it, lid crooked, steam whispering out the sides. A cooler stood open, lid propped back, condensation still slick on the plastic. Dinner had just been interrupted. I stood there with my keys still in my hand, listening. No voices, no footsteps, no engines, just the soft crackle of embers and the distant call of a bird I couldn't place. Something about the sound felt wrong too drawn out, almost strained, like it was trying to be heard. I told myself it was a bathroom break or a short walk. People wander. Especially campers, especially in May, when the woods are waking back up and everyone wants to stretch their legs. Denial is comfortable. It wraps around logic and feels like reason. I set up anyway. That's the part I still struggle to explain. Why I didn't leave right then. Why I didn't trust the quiet voice in my chest that said this isn't normal. But I had driven 6 hours that day. I was tired, and more than that, I was stubborn. I had spent years ignoring my own instincts in a marriage that taught me to doubt myself. Old habits die hard. I parked, leveled the van, stepped out again. As I did, the smell of food hit me stronger now. Onions, meat, something starchy. My stomach tightened, not with hunger, but with the uncanny sense that I'd arrived late to something important. I walked closer to the fire pit. The pot was still warm when I lifted the lid. Stew, thick and dark, barely touched. I remember whispering hello without realizing I'd done it. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the trees. No answer. That's when I noticed the pattern. Every occupied campsite, every single one, looked exactly the same. Chairs pulled out, fires lit, food prepared, lanterns glowing softly as dusk slid toward night, and not a single person anywhere. The sense of unease didn't spike all at once. It crept. It threaded itself through my thoughts slowly, methodically, like fog filling a valley. My skin felt tight, like I was wearing someone else's jacket. The woods pressed in, not visually, but emotionally. The space between the trees felt crowded. I told myself it was coincidence, that maybe a group activity had pulled everyone away at once. A hike, a meeting, a shared lookout point. The year was strange, rules were strange, people did strange things together. But the longer I stood there, the more the logic unraveled. Some chairs had jackets draped over them. One site had a child's sneaker kicked sideways near the fire ring. Another had marshmallows skewered and resting on a log, already half melted. These weren't people who planned to leave. These were people who expected to come back in minutes. The temperature dropped fast as the sun disappeared. The warmth of the fires became pockets of safety in an otherwise cooling world. I realized then that every fire was burning at roughly the same intensity, as if they'd all been lit around the same time. That thought brought a wave of cold through me that had nothing to do with the air. I went back to my van and locked the doors. Inside the Volkswagen, the familiar smell of old upholstery and oil steadied me. I sat in the driver's seat, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to my own breathing. I laughed once, quietly, at myself. It sounded forced, thin. "You're projecting," I muttered. "You're tired." But the quiet outside wasn't normal quiet. It had texture, depth. It felt intentional, like something holding still. A sound cut through it. 3 slow knocks, not on my van, somewhere deeper in the campground. I froze, listening. The knocks came again, spaced evenly. Wood on wood, not loud, not urgent, almost polite. They echoed just enough to make direction hard to judge. I strained to hear voices after it. Footsteps. Anything human. Nothing. The knocks stopped, the silence rushed back in, thicker than before. I felt my heartbeat in my ears, heavy and slow. Panic hadn't arrived yet, but suspicion had taken its seat. Suspicion is worse. Panic moves you. Suspicion roots you in place, whispering that any move might be the wrong one. I cracked the window a half-inch, just enough to let sound in. The smell of smoke slid through, acrid now, mixed with something sour I hadn't noticed before. Rot, maybe. Or damp earth turned to recently. That's when I heard it again, but closer. This time it wasn't knocking. It was dragging. Something heavy scraping over gravel. Slow. Deliberate. Pausing, then continuing. I held my breath, every muscle coiled tight, my mind scrambling for rational explanations. A cooler being moved, a log pulled closer to a fire, but I couldn't escape the feeling that whatever it was, it didn't rush. It didn't need to. The sound stopped outside my sight. I stared at the side mirror, heart hammering now, dread blooming hot in my chest. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a shape entered the edge of the mirror's frame. A camp chair, being pulled by one leg, no hands visible, just the chair sliding across the gravel, leaving a thin, pale line behind it. It stopped directly behind my van. I didn't scream, I didn't move, I didn't even breathe. My mind finally crossed the line from denial into something darker. A certainty without explanation, the kind of knowing that bypasses thought entirely. Whoever or whatever had been sitting in those chairs wasn't gone, and it had noticed me. I stayed frozen long enough for my muscles to start aching, the kind of ache that comes from holding yourself unnaturally still, like prey pretending to be a rock. The chair didn't move again. No footsteps followed it. No breath, no whisper, no sound at all. Just the fire crackling somewhere nearby, indifferent and steady, like a clock ticking in a room where something terrible has already happened. I don't know how long I sat there before I realized my hands were shaking. I eased them off the steering wheel and wiped my palms on my jeans, slow and careful, as if sudden movement might ripple outward through the air and announce me. My thoughts were no longer racing. They had gone quiet, organized around one singular brutal fact. I was not alone, and whatever was here had patience. The smell outside shifted. The comforting edge of cooked food was gone now, replaced by something metallic and damp. It reminded me of rain hitting old leaves, of cellars and places sunlight doesn't reach. The fires continued to burn, but the warmth they promised felt deceptive, like a staged kindness. I told myself to start the engine. I didn't. Fear does strange things to logic. It doesn't always scream run. Sometimes it whispers wait. Wait and listen. Wait and learn the rules before you break them. I leaned forward and peered through the windshield. The lanterns around the loop glowed softly, their halos overlapping, casting long shadows that bent and merged. The empty chairs sat like punctuation marks, marking the absence of people more loudly than bodies ever could. That's when I noticed something new. The chairs weren't empty anymore. Not occupied, just adjusted. Several had been turned slightly, angled toward my van. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough to suggest attention. A slow, crawling pressure tightened behind my eyes. I felt watched, but not in the way you feel when someone's staring from the dark. This was broader, diffuse, like the campground itself had become aware of me. A sound broke the stillness, soft, rhythmic, almost lost beneath the fire crackle. Breathing, not mine. It came from somewhere close, just outside the van, low and measured, as if whoever was doing it had no reason to rush. Each inhale sounded wet, each exhale dragged slightly, like it had weight. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the windshield, trying to triangulate the sound. My pulse thudded hard in my throat. The breathing circled, slow steps crunching gravel so lightly they barely registered. Then came the voice. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Hey, it said softly. Male, maybe. Hoarse, like it hadn't been used in a while. "You got room?" The question hit me harder than a scream would have. It was wrong in a way I can't fully explain. Not the words themselves, but the timing, the calm, the assumption. I stayed silent. The voice chuckled, low and humorless. "Don't be rude, we've been waiting." Something brushed the side of the van, not a knock, a touch. Fingertips, maybe. Dragging lightly along the metal panel, slow enough that I could feel the vibration through the frame. My stomach lurched. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. The touch moved toward the driver's door. Every instinct I had finally aligned into one command: now. I turned the key. The engine coughed once, loud, ugly, echoing through the campground like a gunshot. The breathing outside stopped instantly. The fingertips vanished. The engine stalled. Panic surged, white-hot and total. I twisted the key again, harder this time, whispering a frantic plea to a machine that had never cared about me before. The Volkswagen hesitated, then roared to life, headlights blazing, flooding the campsite with harsh white light. What I saw or didn't see will stay with me forever. The chair behind my van was gone. So were the others. Every single one. The fires were still burning. The food still sat untouched. But the chairs, those quiet witnesses, had vanished completely, as if they'd never existed at all. I slammed the van into gear and hit the gas. Gravel sprayed. The tires screamed in protest as I tore down the loop road, headlights slicing through trees that seemed to lean inward as I passed. The sense of pursuit was immediate and overwhelming. Not footsteps, not vehicles, but pressure, like the air itself was closing the distance. I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. Shapes moved between the lantern-lit sights. Tall, thin silhouettes slipping from firelight to shadow, too smooth, too coordinated. They didn't run. They didn't need to. The road curved sharply, and my headlights caught something ahead that made my chest seize. The campground exit was blocked, not by a gate, by chairs. Dozens of them, dragged from every site and arranged across the road in a loose, chaotic barricade. Some upright, some overturned, a few stacked as if by uncertain hands still learning how to build. I swore aloud, slamming the brakes. The van skidded sideways, stopping just short of the pile. My breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. The engine idled loudly, far too loudly, announcing me. The smell was stronger here, rot and smoke and something old. A shape stepped into the edge of the headlights. Then another, then more. They didn't look right, not fully. Their limbs bent at slightly wrong angles, movements delayed by half a beat like a bad signal. Their faces, God, their faces were familiar in the most unsettling way. Campers, families, a man in a flannel jacket, a woman with her hair pulled back, even a child standing too still, eyes reflecting the light like an animal's. Their mouths opened in unison. "You're early," they said together. The sound layered over itself, voices overlapping just enough to feel wrong, like a recording played back through multiple speakers slightly out of sync. I felt something inside me crack, not break, but split open, a clarity born of pure survival. These weren't people who had been taken. These were people who had stayed. I threw the van into reverse, hands slapped the sides now, dozens of them, flat palms hitting metal, not aggressive, just guiding, steering. The van rocked as I backed away, tires crunching over gravel, my foot shaking on the pedal. "Don't," the voices said, closer now, softer. "There's room." The chairs shifted on their own, scraping, rearranging, opening a narrow path forward as if offering compromise. I didn't take it. I spun the wheel hard, cutting across a patch of grass, aiming straight for the tree line. Branches scraped the sides of the van, leaves exploded across the windshield. Something heavy thudded against the roof and slid off. Then, suddenly, the pressure vanished. The woods opened onto the main road in a burst of asphalt and moonlight. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until the gas gauge dipped below empty, and the sky began to pale with the promise of morning. I pulled over miles away, shaking so hard I could barely put the van in park. When the sun rose, I sat there in the quiet aftermath, listening to birdsong that sounded impossibly innocent. The fear had burned itself down to embers, leaving something heavier behind. Understanding. Those chairs weren't waiting for people who never came back. They were waiting for replacements. Since that night, I don't camp where fires are already lit. I don't trust warmth without witnesses. And when I see an empty chair facing the woods angled just slightly toward me, I don't rationalize it away. I leave. Because some places don't want you dead. They want you to stay. I didn't sleep for 2 days after that night. Not real sleep. Just shallow, drifting blackouts where my body shut down before my mind could follow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw chairs scraping across gravel, heard that layered voice saying there's room, felt the van shudder beneath hands that weren't trying to hurt me, just hold me. By the third morning, exhaustion finally forced me off the road. I pulled into a rest stop just south of the Catskills, parked beneath a flickering sodium light, and sat with my forehead pressed against the steering wheel. My reflection in the windshield looked older, thinner, like something essential had been filed away inside me. That's when I realized the worst part hadn't been the fear, it was the invitation. Fear, I understood. Panic, too. But what unsettled me, what kept crawling back into my thoughts, was how reasonable it had all felt in the end. How calm those voices were. How gently the chairs rearranged themselves, as if compromise were still possible, as if staying wasn't a threat, but a kindness. I drove home later that day, back to Pennsylvania, back to familiar roads and grocery stores and neighbors who waved from a distance. Life resumed its shape around me, but I didn't fit back into it cleanly. Sounds lingered longer than they should. Smells carried weight. Every empty parking lot, every abandoned picnic table felt charged. I had like it was waiting for permission to speak. Weeks passed. Then months. I tried to convince myself it had been stress, isolation, a mind fraying at the edges under the pressure of that year. But the rational explanations collapsed under one simple fact. I hadn't imagined the chairs. They started showing up. Not everywhere. Just enough. A single folding chair left open in the middle of a trailhead parking lot. A ring of them arranged neatly near a riverbank where no one was fishing. Once, at a closed campground I passed while driving north again, against my better judgment, I saw a familiar configuration. 3 chairs angled inward around a cold fire pit, waiting, always empty, always adjusted just slightly toward wherever I stood. I stopped camping after that, sold most of my gear, kept the Volkswagen though. I couldn't bring myself to let it go. It felt like a witness. Proof that something real had happened, that I hadn't just unraveled quietly and alone. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. In October of that same year, I found myself back in upstate New York. Not at the campground, I wasn't that reckless, but close enough that the trees felt familiar, the air carrying that same damp mineral scent. I told myself I was passing through. I told myself I wouldn't stop. I stopped. The campground was closed now, officially at least. Yellow tape hung loose between posts, signs warning visitors to stay out. I parked on the shoulder and walked the perimeter, heart thudding with each step. The woods were louder this time. Wind moving through branches, leaves skittering across the ground, life asserting itself. The loop road was visible through the trees. And the chairs were back. Not many, just a handful. Scattered, not arranged, as if something had grown tired of order. One lay on its side, fabric torn, metal frame bent. Another stood upright near the fire pit where I'd first smelled that warm stew months earlier. I didn't go closer. I didn't need to. The lesson had settled deep by then, etched into instinct. Some places don't announce their danger with violence. They seduce with familiarity, with comfort, with the promise that you don't have to keep moving anymore. I stood there longer than I should have, watching the empty campground breathe. The fires weren't lit this time. The air was cold, honest, and still I felt it, the same pressure, lighter now, almost curious. A whisper brushed the edge of my hearing. Not words, just a sound like fabric shifting, like someone pulling out a chair. I turned and walked away. I don't tell this story to scare people away from the woods. The woods are honest. They don't pretend to be anything else. It's the spaces we carve into them, the campsites, the clearings, the places meant for rest, that sometimes remember us too well. They remember how tired we are, how lonely, how tempting it is to sit down and let someone else decide when we should get back up. I still drive, still wander, but I choose my stops carefully now. I camp where voices carry, where laughter overlaps, where chairs are folded up at night and fires are drowned properly. I trust the places that don't mind being empty. And when I arrive somewhere and see signs of life without life itself, warm food, glowing lanterns, chairs waiting patiently, I don't hesitate anymore. I don't investigate. I don't call out. I leave. Because some invitations are older than fear and far more dangerous than threats. And if you ever find yourself standing in a quiet campground where everything is ready and no one is there, listen to that unease tightening in your chest. It's not paranoia, it's memory. The land remembering everyone who sat down and never stood back up. The sound didn't come from outside the RV at first. It came from underneath my feet, a deep, patient pressure like something leaning its weight against the floor and deciding whether to push harder. My name is Ethan Hale. I was 39 that August, old enough to believe I understood risk, young enough to think preparation could tame it. I grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona, where you learn early that the land doesn't announce its moods. It just changes them. By the time my wife, Mara, and I decided to take our 2 kids, Caleb, 11, and Nora, 7, down to Lake Mead in our Volkswagen camper, I'd logged thousands of miles in RVs and vans across the Southwest. Desert heat, mechanical quirks, empty roads. I thought I knew the language of all of it. That was my first mistake. Believing the land speaks only one language. We arrived in early August 2022 when the heat presses down like a hand you can't swat away. The lake was low, exposing pale scars of earth that looked freshly wounded. Our site sat far enough from the water that the smell of drying algae drifted in waves, sharp and sour, mixing with hot rubber and dust. I remember thinking the place felt unfinished, like the ground hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. The Volkswagen was a newer model, compact by RV standards, but fitted with a slide-out we'd added for longer stays. When extended, it gave us just enough room to breathe without feeling boxed in. I parked, leveled, and hit the switch. The slide-out moved smoothly at first, that familiar electric hum steady and reassuring. Then it hesitated, just a second, a stutter. I felt it through the soles of my shoes before I heard it, a low scrape, not metal on metal, but something denser, duller. I told myself it was a rock. Lake Mead was full of them, half buried and waiting to remind you they'd been there long before tires ever touched them. The slide-out stopped halfway. I let go of the switch. The hum died. Silence rushed in so fast it felt loud. Caleb was already peering out the window, narrating the scene like he always did, while Nora pressed her face against the screen door, asking if we could go down to the water before sunset. Mara looked at me, that look she gives when she's trusting me to decide, and also quietly measuring how sure I seem. I tried the switch again. The motor whined, strained, then cut off with a sharp click. That's when the pressure came back, slow, deliberate, lifting slightly against the floor beneath the dinette. Not a jolt, not a bump, a shift. I crouched and pressed my palm flat to the vinyl flooring. It was warm from the heat, but beneath that warmth was something else, a vibration that didn't match the rhythm of the motor or the wind. It felt patient, as if whatever caused it had all the time in the world. Probably the frame flexing, I said, mostly to myself. The words sounded thin in the air. I grabbed the flashlight from the side compartment and stepped outside. The sun was low, turning the exposed lake bed into a field of long shadows. Cicadas buzzed in bursts that rose and fell like broken alarms. I knelt and shined the light beneath the slide-out. Dust, dry earth, a tangle of weeds flattened by our arrival. Nothing alive, nothing moving. And yet, when I stood, the sense of being watched didn't fade. It sharpened, like my awareness had been tuned to the wrong frequency and couldn't tune back. I crawled under the rear instead, checking the supports, the rails, the underside of the slide mechanism. Everything looked intact. No bent metal, no obvious obstruction. The flashlight beam caught on something darker beneath the dirt, a shape that could have been a shadow, could have been a rock. I reached toward it, then stopped. The ground smelled wrong. Not rot exactly. Not death. More like dampness trapped where dampness shouldn't be. An underground smell, cold and heavy, pressing up through the cracks in the heat. It made the back of my throat tighten. "Dad?" Caleb called. "Did we break it?" "No," I said too quickly. "Just give me a minute." I backed out and brushed the dust off my arms. The temperature seemed to drop as the sun slipped lower, but the air stayed thick, refusing to cool. I decided to retract the slide out fully, reassess in the morning. I stepped inside, hit the switch, the motor engaged, the slide out moved an inch. Then something pushed back. The floor flexed this time, enough that Nora yelped and grabbed Mara's arm. The cabinets rattled softly, a nervous clatter. Beneath it all was that sound again, deeper now, like a weight shifting on packed earth. I killed the switch. No one spoke. The silence stretched, filling with distant laughter from another campsite, the splash of water far away. Normal sounds. Human sounds. They felt out of place, like they belonged to a different version of this evening. "Is it an animal?" Mara asked quietly. I wanted to say yes, a burrowing animal, a bad angle, anything that fit neatly into a box I could close. But animals don't press. They don't test boundaries. They panic or flee. This felt like neither. I grabbed the emergency jack and positioned it near the slide-out's edge, hoping to relieve pressure on the mechanism. As I cranked, the metal groaned, and for a moment the vibration eased. Relief washed through me, thin and fragile. Then the ground beneath the RV shifted. Not a tremor, a drag. The jack tilted. The slide-out lurched, scraping hard enough that the sound went through my teeth. Something underneath moved sideways, slow and heavy, as if adjusting to the new resistance. Nora started crying. Caleb went silent, his eyes locked on the floor like he could see through it. I lowered the jack and stepped back, heart hammering now, the denial finally cracking. I didn't know what was under there, but I knew it wasn't leaving just because I wanted it to. Night came fast after that. The desert does that, drops darkness like a curtain. We turned on the interior lights, their glow making the windows feel like exposed skin. I considered unhooking and driving out, slide out stuck or not, but the idea of moving while whatever was beneath us shifted with the vehicle sent a spike of fear through my chest. If it tore something vital loose, we were stuck. The first knock came just after full dark. It wasn't loud, just a dull thud from beneath the slide-out, followed by a pause long enough for me to convince myself I imagined it. Then another. Same spot. Same measured force. Mara squeezed my hand. I could feel her pulse racing, matching mine. The kids huddled together, whispering questions we didn't answer. I turned off the lights. In the darkness, every sound grew teeth. The wind against the RV skin sounded like breathing. The smell from the ground seeped in stronger now, that cold, damp note threading through the heat. Underneath it all, faint but unmistakable, was movement. Slow, dragging, circling beneath us. I pressed my ear to the floor. Whatever was under there wasn't trying to get in. It was trying to figure us out. And as I lay there listening to the weight shift again, closer this time, right beneath where my children slept, I realized with a clarity that cut through the fear. The RV wasn't just stuck on something. We had parked on top of it. The weight shifted again, slow enough that I could count my own breaths between movements, heavy enough that the RV answered with a low groan from its frame, like a tired animal rolling in its sleep and finding pain instead of rest. I didn't move. None of us did. Mara's hand was still locked in mine, her fingers cold despite the heat trapped inside the camper. Caleb had slid down onto the floor, his back against the cabinet, knees pulled tight to his chest. Nora was half asleep, half crying, the kind of fragile state where a child's mind keeps slipping between dreams and fear because it doesn't know which one is safer. Another knock came, closer to the center now, not just under the slide-out. The sound traveled through the floorboards into my ribs. It wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it. Pressure. Release. Pressure again, like something testing how much it could push without drawing attention. I realized then that whatever was underneath us understood stillness. The thought hollowed me out. I reached for my phone, keeping the movement slow, deliberate. No sudden shifts, no scraping feet. The screen lit my face faintly as I opened the campground map. Lake Mead sprawled around us in dead zones and half-occupied loops. The ranger station was miles away, and the emergency number would bring someone, but not quickly and not quietly. I imagined headlights cutting through the darkness, tires crunching gravel, the RV vibrating with every footstep approaching. The weight paused, as if listening. I set the phone face down. For a long stretch, nothing happened. The desert outside breathed. Somewhere far off, a generator kicked on, then died. The smell under the RV thickened, seeping upward like the ground itself was exhaling. It wasn't just damp now. There was iron in it. Rust. Old water trapped too long in the dark. I whispered to Mara, barely shaping the words. If it moves again, we wake the kids and go. How? She whispered back. The slide. I don't care, I said. And I meant it. The camper could tear itself apart for all I cared. Metal could be replaced. People couldn't. As if in response, the pressure surged. The floor bowed just enough that a cup slid off the counter and shattered. The sound was sharp, sudden, wrong. Nora jerked awake, screaming now, full-throated and terrified. Caleb scrambled to his feet, his face pale, eyes wide and wet. And beneath us, something shifted fast. Not panicked, not frantic. Decisive. The RV rocked once, hard, then settled. The knocking stopped. In its place came a dragging sound, circling, scraping earth and stone. I felt it move from one side to the other, the vibration traveling like a pulse through the frame. Wherever it went, the ground responded, compressing under its weight. It's leaving, Caleb whispered, hope breaking through his fear. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But the sound didn't fade. It repositioned, right under the driver's side, the engine side. The realization hit me like cold water. It wasn't trying to get away. It was trying to get us off. I didn't explain. There wasn't time, and I didn't want the thought living in my kids' heads the way it had just nested in mine. I grabbed the keys. The RV groaned as I shifted my weight toward the front, the steering wheel cool and solid under my hands. Seatbelts, I said, louder now. Firm. The voice I use when there's no room for argument. Mara moved instantly, snapping Nora's belt, pulling Caleb close. I turned the key. The engine coughed. Underneath us, the weight pressed up, hard enough this time that the dash rattled, hard enough that my teeth clicked together. The engine coughed again. I pressed the gas gently, afraid to rev, afraid of what a sudden vibration might provoke. The starter whined, then, mercifully, the engine caught. The sound filled the RV, loud and alive and human. The pressure eased, not gone, just waiting. I shifted into drive. The slide-out, still half extended, screamed in protest as the RV lurched forward inches, then stopped dead. Something underneath had locked us in place, braced itself against the movement. The engine strained and I backed off immediately, heart slamming against my ribs. The knock came again, this time directly under my feet. 1, 2, 3, then a long, grinding shove. The RV tilted just slightly, enough to send a wave of dizziness through me. Outside, dust billowed past the windows, illuminated by our headlights. I saw the ground moving, not collapsing, not cracking, but rising, pushed from below in a slow swell that followed the shape of whatever was underneath. Mara was crying now, silent tears streaking down her face as she held the kids. I felt a hot, sharp anger cut through the fear. Anger at myself, at this place, at the stupid confidence that had parked us here and assumed the ground would just accept it. I did the only thing I could think of. I floored it. The engine roared, a sudden violent sound that shattered the careful stillness we'd been trapped in. The RV bucked. The slide-out tore free with a scream of metal, snapping something beneath us with a sound like a bone breaking. The whole camper lurched forward, tires spinning, then catching. Behind us, the ground collapsed inward. I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror. Not a clear shape, not something I could describe cleanly, but a mass withdrawing, pulling itself back into the earth, dragging dirt and stone with it as if retreating from light. The smell spiked, sharp and metallic, then vanished as quickly as it had come. We didn't stop driving until the campground lights were a mile behind us. I pulled onto a turnout, hands shaking so badly I had to force them still. The kids were crying openly now, the fear finally releasing its grip. Mara leaned her forehead against mine, and for a moment we just breathed. Ragged, uneven breaths that tasted like dust and exhaust and survival. In the harsh white of the headlights, I got out and inspected the damage. The slide-out hung crooked, its supports twisted, the underside gouged deep. Clumps of dark, wet earth clung to the metal, smelling nothing like the dry desert around us. There were no tracks, no prints, just a disturbed patch of ground that looked smoothed over, as if whatever had been there had already been swallowed back into the lake bed. We didn't call anyone. We didn't wait for explanations. We drove through the night, out of the park, out of the basin, until the land rose and the air cooled and the ground felt solid again. Months later, after repairs and reports and rational explanations that never quite fit, I went back through the photos I'd taken that day. In one frame, just one, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A subtle bulge in the dirt beneath the RV, right where the slide-out would extend. A shape that didn't belong to rocks or roots or erosion. I don't camp near receding water anymore. I don't trust ground that's been exposed too quickly, land that hasn't learned how to be land again. And when I hear stories about RVs settling overnight, about strange mechanical failures that don't add up, I listen differently now, because some places don't want you there. And if you ignore that long enough, they don't chase you away. They wait until you park. The road carried us out of the basin, climbing slowly, the engine humming like it was trying to calm itself after what we'd forced it to do. The kids eventually fell asleep, exhaustion overtaking fear in the back seats. Mara stared out the passenger window, her reflection ghosted over the darkness outside, eyes still searching for movement that wasn't there anymore. I kept driving. Every time the tires hit a patch of uneven asphalt, my body tensed, bracing for the feeling of pressure from below. It took hours before my hands stopped shaking on the steering wheel. Even then, the fear didn't leave. It just settled deeper, quieter, like a bruise you forget about until you touch it wrong. We pulled into a rest area near dawn. The sky was pale and colorless, the desert stripped of its drama in daylight. I shut off the engine and sat there, listening to the ticking metal as it cooled. For the first time since Lake Mead, the ground felt inert, dead, ordinary. I stepped outside alone. The underside of the RV looked worse in the morning light. The slide-out rails were bent, scraped raw. The jack mount was twisted like someone had grabbed it and wrenched it sideways. But what froze me wasn't the damage, it was what wasn't there. No fur, no scales, no blood. Just deep, wide impressions pressed into the dirt that clung to the frame, as if something broad and heavy had been wrapped around the undercarriage. The marks weren't sharp or defined, they were smooth. Smoothed by weight, not claws. I scraped some of the dirt loose with a tire iron. It was damp underneath, almost muddy, despite the dry air and rising sun. The smell rose again, faint now, but unmistakable. That underground cold. That trapped water rot. Mara joined me, wrapping her arms around herself. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need answers. We were past that. Past the part where knowing would help. We drove on. The repair shop in Kingman took one look and asked where we'd been. When I said Lake Mead, the mechanic nodded slowly, like he'd already guessed. He didn't press for details. He just told me the slide-out motor had seized from external pressure, not internal failure. Something pushed where it shouldn't, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. You're lucky it didn't rip the whole side open. Lucky. The word felt wrong in my mouth. That night, in a cheap motel, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while the others slept. Every time a truck passed on the highway, I felt it in my chest. The memory replayed not as images, but as sensations. The slow press against the floor, the careful testing knocks, the way the ground had risen like muscle under skin. What haunted me most wasn't the fear. It was the restraint. Whatever had been under us could have done more. I knew that with a certainty that made my stomach twist. It hadn't panicked. It hadn't lashed out blindly. It had reacted, adjusted, tried to move us without tearing us apart until the engine noise forced a decision. It wasn't mindless. That thought followed me home, followed me into the weeks that came after. I stopped taking the RV out, told myself it was for repairs, for the kids, for work. The truth was simpler. I didn't trust the ground anymore, not the way I used to. I started reading, not forums or campfire stories, the official stuff, geological surveys, reports on subsidence around Lake Mead, old records from before the dam, before the water rose and fell and rose again. I learned about sinkholes, about underground caverns exposed too quickly, about pockets of land that stayed wet and unstable long after the surface dried. And I learned something else. There were gaps, whole stretches of shoreline history that were thin, poorly documented. Mentions of ground movement anomalies, notes about equipment failures, about heavy machinery bogging down where it shouldn't, stories dismissed as erosion or bad luck, stories that sounded uncomfortably familiar. I never told the kids everything. I let their memories soften, blur around the edges. Children deserve that mercy. But sometimes Nora wakes up crying, saying she dreamed the bed was breathing. Caleb won't camp near water anymore. Not rivers, not lakes, not even reservoirs that look calm and harmless. Mara still takes my hand when the RV creaks in the wind. As for me, I listen now. I listen to the way the ground sounds when I step on it, to the way a campsite smells before sunset, to that subtle feeling, almost like pressure behind the eyes, when a place feels wrong and I can't explain why. The desert isn't empty. It's patient. It remembers weight. It remembers being buried and uncovered and buried again. And sometimes when you park in the wrong place at the wrong time, it remembers you. People ask why I tell this story, why I don't let it fade into one bad night, one mechanical failure, one fluke. The answer is simple, because the RV didn't break first. The land moved first, and it moved with intention. So if you take anything from this, anything at all, let it be this. When the ground presses back, when the silence feels deliberate, when your instincts whisper that something beneath you is listening, don't argue, don't rationalize. Don't assume the earth will always hold you just because it did before. Pack up, pull out, leave while you still can. Some places don't want company, and some things don't need to chase you to make that clear. The first thing that told me something was wrong wasn't the silence. It was the way the silence seemed to recognize me. I remember slowing the RV as the gravel road narrowed, the trees closing in on both sides like they were leaning forward to listen. This was rural Missouri, early April of 2019, the kind of place where cell service fades without warning and the map stops updating like it's decided you're on your own now. I was 38 then, traveling alone for the first time since my divorce, chasing the idea that solitude on the road could sand down the sharp edges I'd been carrying for years. I'd told myself I wasn't running from anything. I was just moving. My name is Marcus Hale. I grew up in Kansas, flatland, open skies. I thought I understood quiet. Missouri taught me I didn't. The RV park wasn't on the original plan. I'd been aiming for a state campground farther south, but a wrong turn and a dying fuel gauge nudged me into improvisation. That's how these stories always start, I know. A detour, a compromise, a small decision you barely remember making until it's the only one that matters. The entrance came up suddenly. A break in the trees. A rusted metal gate pulled open just enough to suggest permission. And there, hanging from two chains between wooden posts, was a hand-painted sign. Welcome, Marcus. Not welcome campers. Not vacancy available. Just my name. Block letters. Red paint, uneven, like the brush had been too dry. I actually laughed out loud. A short, nervous bark that fogged the windshield for a second. My first thought was coincidence. Someone else named Marcus. Common enough. My second thought was that maybe I'd booked this place online and forgotten. Memory does funny things when you've been alone too long. Still, I didn't pull in right away. I sat there with the engine idling, listening to it tick and hum, noticing how the air felt heavier than it had a mile back. The woods weren't silent anymore. They were muted, like someone had turned the volume down, but off. Birds somewhere far away. A low, almost imperceptible rustle, as if the trees were adjusting their footing. I told myself not to be dramatic. I told myself I was tired. I pulled in. The gravel crunched under the tires, loud in the narrow clearing. The sign swung slightly as I passed it, chains creaking in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting the name to change, to blink into something else. It didn't. The office was a converted double wide at the center of the park. A single porch light buzzed even though the sun was still up, casting a pale halo over a row of plastic chairs. No one was sitting in them. No cars, no voices, just my RV and the smell of damp earth and old leaves. I stepped out and felt it immediately. The cold. Not the normal spring chill, but a deeper cold that pressed through my jacket and settled against my skin like it had been waiting. The air smelled wrong, too. Sweet, almost. Like overripe fruit mixed with mildew. I knocked on the office door. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time, and that's when I noticed the bulletin board beside the door. Flyers tacked haphazardly, edges curled from moisture. Camp rules. Fire warnings. A handwritten notice that read, "Quiet hours strictly enforced." We hear everything. I remember frowning at that. It didn't feel like a joke. The door opened without a sound. A man stood there, thin and stooped, wearing denim overalls and a shirt that might once have been white. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, and he smiled like he'd been holding it in for a while. "Evenin', Marcus," he said. I froze. The world narrowed to the sound of my name in his mouth. "How?" I started, then stopped. I didn't want to sound accusatory, didn't want to be rude. That instinct to smooth things over, to assume good intentions, had followed me my whole life. It had cost me more than I liked to admit. "You're expected," he said, stepping aside. Site 7. Power hookup's been temperamental, but she'll hold if you don't draw too much. I followed him inside without really deciding to. The office smelled like dust and something metallic underneath. Old keys hung from hooks behind the counter, each labeled with numbers that didn't quite line up. He slid a clipboard toward me. My name was already written at the top. Full name, spelled correctly. I didn't remember telling anyone my last name. "Did I make a reservation?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He chuckled softly. "You always do." Something in the way he said always made my stomach tighten. I signed anyway. Denial is a powerful thing. It tells you that the strange is manageable, that unease is just imagination flexing its muscles. I told myself this was a themed park, a gimmick, maybe a friend playing a prank. I didn't have many friends left, but the mind will invent possibilities just to avoid the truth pressing too close. Site 7 was at the far edge of the park, backed up against the tree line. As I parked, the sun dipped lower, dragging shadows across the ground like long fingers. I plugged in the RV, listening to the power hum to life, and tried to focus on the normal rituals, leveling the rig, checking the locks, setting up the small folding chair outside. That's when I noticed the other sites. They were occupied, not by people, by things left behind. Lawn chairs facing inward, like a conversation paused mid-sentence, coolers with lids open, a child's shoe lying on its side near a fire pit, laces undone. No trash, no signs of struggle. Just absence. The kind that feels deliberate. The wind shifted, carrying a sound with it, a knock. 3 soft taps spaced evenly, coming from somewhere in the woods. I stood still, breath held, listening. Another set of knocks followed, closer this time. Wood on wood, maybe? Or knuckles on bark. I couldn't tell. "Hello? Hello?" I called, hating how small my voice sounded. No answer. I retreated into the RV and locked the door. The metal felt thin under my hand. I turned on the radio for noise, but all I got was static that seemed to pulse, rising and falling like breathing. I shut it off. Night came fast. The temperature dropped again, enough that I could see my breath inside the RV. The heater kicked on, then off, then on again, struggling. I wrapped myself in a blanket and tried to sleep, telling myself I'd leave at first light. No harm in that. Just a bad vibe, that's all. The knocking came back. This time it was on the RV door. 3 taps. Even. Patient. Marcus? A voice whispered from the other side. It sounded like my own. I didn't answer. I couldn't move. My heart hammered so hard I was sure whoever or whatever was outside could hear it. The taps repeated, a little firmer now, and with them came the faint smell of that sweetness again, seeping through the seams, filling my lungs. I realized then that this place hadn't just welcomed me. It had been waiting. I stayed frozen long after the knocking stopped, my hand gripping the edge of the table like it might slide away if I let go. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It wasn't empty. It was attentive, like something had leaned back, satisfied, waiting to see what I'd do next. I don't know how much time passed before I finally moved. Minutes, maybe, or hours. Time behaves strangely when fear settles in. It stretches, thins, loses its edges. The heater clicked on again, coughing warm air that smelled faintly burnt, and that small, ordinary sound was enough to snap something in me. I told myself I couldn't stay like this. That panic was more dangerous than whatever had knocked. I eased myself toward the window and peeled back the curtain just enough to see outside. The porch light from the office barely reached this far, but moonlight spilled through the trees in broken patches. My folding chair was gone, the one I'd set up an hour earlier. In its place, directly in front of the RV door, sat a wooden stool I hadn't seen before. Old. Handmade. And resting on it, carefully folded, was a sheet of paper. The smell was stronger now. Sweet. Rotting. Familiar in a way that made my throat tighten. I didn't open the door. I cracked the window instead, just enough to let the night air in. Cold rushed over my face, sharp and wet. I leaned out and squinted, trying to read the paper from a distance. It was a map. Not a printed one. Hand-drawn. Crude lines marking the campsites, the office, the tree line. And there, at Site 7, a small red X. Next to it, written in the same uneven block letters as the sign at the gate, were 2 words, "Stay here." I pulled the curtain shut and slid down against the wall, breathing hard. This was the moment denial finally cracked. Up until then, I'd been bending reality to fit comfort. Coincidence, gimmick, miscommunication. But maps don't draw themselves, and no one guesses a stranger's name, writes it out in paint, waits for him to arrive, and whispers it back in his own voice unless they've been watching, listening, learning. The emotional weight of that realization hit me harder than fear. It felt intimate, violating, like discovering fingerprints on the inside of your skull. I thought about leaving. Of course I did. Turning the key, tearing down that gravel road, never looking back. But fear has layers, and beneath the obvious terror was something quieter and more dangerous. Doubt. What if the gate was locked now? What if the road out wasn't the same road in? I'd driven long enough through those woods to know how easy it was to get turned around, and there was another thought, one I didn't want to admit even to myself. What if leaving was what they expected? I stayed inside, lights off, listening. The woods had resumed their low murmur, wind through branches, something moving slowly across the ground, leaves shifting under careful weight. Once, I heard footsteps circle the RV, stopping just outside the bedroom window. I held my breath until my chest burned. Sleep came in fragments, short, shallow drops into darkness, each one punctured by dreams where I was standing at that welcome sign, watching the letters of my name peel off and rearrange themselves into words I didn't understand but somehow knew were meant for me. I woke just before dawn. The cold had deepened overnight. My hands were numb, fingers stiff as I reached for the coffee maker out of habit. The power flickered, then died completely. Silence rushed in to fill the space it left. I didn't bother with coffee. I packed fast, movements jerky, uncoordinated. I avoided the windows, keeping my eyes on my hands, my bag, the door. When I finally opened it, I expected resistance. Another knock. A voice. There was nothing. The stool was gone. The paper map too. My folding chair was back where I'd left it, unfolded, angled slightly differently like someone had used it and tried poorly to put it back. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. Nothing. The engine clicked once, weakly, then went still. "No," I whispered, pressing my forehead to the steering wheel. I tried again. Same result. Dead. That was when I saw the new sign. It stood at the edge of my sight, propped against a tree that hadn't been there yesterday. Fresh paint glistened in the early light. Mornings are hard, Marcus. Something inside me broke then, not loudly, not all at once, but in a slow, crumbling way. Anger bled into the fear, hot and sharp. I stepped out of the RV despite every instinct screaming not to. The ground felt spongy under my boots, like it had been recently turned. "Who are you?" I shouted into the trees. "What do you want?" The echo came back wrong, not delayed, immediate, as if the forest had been waiting to answer. "You stay," it said. A dozen voices layered together, women, young, old, all flat, all certain. I ran back toward the office, not toward the gate. I ran into the woods, branches clawing at my jacket, roots grabbing at my feet. The smell followed me, thickening, and with it came whispers, half-formed sentences brushing the edges of my thoughts. Regrets, names, moments I hadn't thought about in years. My ex-wife's voice, my father's last words. Things I'd buried because they hurt too much to carry. The woods knew them. I burst into a clearing I hadn't seen on the map. In the center stood a long wooden board, like a wall laid flat. Names were carved into it, hundreds of them, some deep and careful, others rushed, jagged. I found mine near the bottom. Fresh, still rough around the edges. That was the moment panic gave way to clarity. This place wasn't hunting bodies. It was collecting stories. People who arrived carrying unfinished grief, unresolved guilt, the kind of emotional weight that sinks you slowly if you don't let it go. The park didn't trap you with locks or chains. It pressed on the parts of you already stuck, already tired of moving forward, until staying felt easier than leaving. I stepped back from the board, shaking. "No," I said aloud, "you don't get to keep me." I turned and ran again, this time listening less to fear and more to instinct. I followed the slope of the land, the way the air moved, the faint pull toward something open. Branches thinned, light widened, and suddenly, impossibly, I was standing at the gate. The sign was blank now. I didn't stop to question it. I ran the gravel road barefoot, lungs burning, until asphalt tore into my feet and a passing truck screeched to a halt. They found the RV later, abandoned. Engine working fine. No signs of damage. The park, though, it wasn't there when the sheriff went back. Just trees. No gate. No office. No sign. I don't camp alone anymore. And every time I pass a hand-painted sign on a back road welcoming someone by name, I feel that cold again. Not because I'm afraid of the woods, but because I know they're still listening. I didn't tell anyone the full story at first. Not the truck driver who wrapped my bleeding feet in a blanket. Not the sheriff who asked polite questions with tired eyes. Not even the mechanic who swore there was nothing wrong with my RV when it was recovered 2 days later, parked neatly at the edge of a county road, like it had been delivered there on purpose. I learned quickly that when you explain too much, people stop listening. So I kept it simple. I said I got turned around. I said the place felt off. I said I panicked. All of that was true, just not complete. What I didn't say was that the quiet followed me for weeks afterward. Not literal silence. Traffic still roared, radios still played, but a thinner kind of quiet underneath everything, like a pressure change in the air. I'd wake up at night convinced someone had just said my name. I'd catch myself reading signs too closely, searching for patterns that weren't there. Or maybe were. I left Missouri the next morning. I didn't take back roads anymore. I stayed in larger parks, crowded ones, places where laughter spilled from neighboring campsites and generators hummed all night. Noise became a kind of armor. I told myself that was enough, but fear doesn't end just because you outrun the place it started. It settles in. It waits for stillness. Months passed. Spring bled into summer. The road did what the road always does. It keeps moving whether you heal or not. I learned new routines, new precautions. I stopped improvising. I planned obsessively. I called ahead. I triple-checked reservations. I told myself I was being smart. What I didn't admit was that I was afraid of being seen again. because that was the real horror of that park, not the knocking, not the voices, not even the names carved into wood. It was the certainty that something had looked at me and understood exactly where I was weakest. Not physically, emotionally. I'd gone on the road pretending I wanted freedom, but what I really wanted was escape. From a marriage I hadn't fought hard enough to save, from guilt I never unpacked, from the quiet realization that I'd spent years avoiding stillness, because stillness made me listen to myself. That park didn't create my fear. It reflected it. I understood that one night in late August, parked at a rest stop outside Flagstaff. The desert was cool and wide and honest. No trees pressing in, no shadows pretending to be doorways, just stars and distance and my own breathing. I'd shut everything off, engine, lights, phone, and sat there with nothing but the sound of wind moving across sand. And for the first time since Missouri, I didn't feel watched. I felt exposed. The difference matters. That's when I finally let myself think about the names on that board. About how many there were. About how some were carved deep and careful, like someone had wanted to be remembered, while others looked rushed, panicked, as if the person holding the blade had realized too late what they were doing. I thought about the empty campsites, the chairs facing inward, the lives paused mid-sentence. I realized then that not everyone who arrives at that place disappears physically. Some probably leave just like I did, barely, changed, shaken. But something stays behind anyway, a piece of hesitation, a habit of doubt, a voice that whispers stay when you know you shouldn't. I started talking after that, slowly, carefully, not about the supernatural parts, not at first, but about listening to your instincts on the road, about how unease isn't weakness, how discomfort is often the first honest signal you get. I told other RVers to trust the moments that don't make sense yet. Some nodded, some smiled politely. A few looked at me like they understood more than they were saying. One man pulled me aside at a campground in New Mexico and asked if I'd ever been to Missouri, rural Missouri, April, a few years back. He didn't finish the question. He didn't have to. I still travel. I don't think I could stop even if I wanted to. The road is stitched into me now, for better or worse. But I travel differently. I don't run from quiet anymore. I negotiate with it. I sit with it long enough to know whether it's empty or listening. And when I see signs, real signs, not painted ones, I read them the way they're meant to be read, as warnings, as invitations, as reflections of the people who put them there. Every once in a while, when I'm tired enough, when the sky is low and the trees crowd close, I think about that blank sign at the gate, how my name disappeared from it the moment I chose to leave. That's the part that stays with me. The park didn't chase me. It let me go, because it only keeps the ones who are already halfway convinced they deserve to stay. So if you're out there rolling down a back road you didn't plan to be on, and you come across a place that feels too familiar too fast, if the welcome feels personal before you've said a word, don't argue with the feeling. Don't rationalize it. Don't tell yourself you're being dramatic. Turn around. Not because the woods are evil, not because the dark is alive, but because some places don't want your body. They want your reasons for leaving. And once you give those up, the road gets very hard to find again.